So good afternoon, everyone. I know that there are a lot of competing demands this afternoon. I'm really pleased that you came to our session today about how the American Jewish community can get more involved in immigration issues at the local level and what variety of forms that might take. My name is Naomi Steinberg. I'm the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy at HIAS. And I bet that a lot of you in the room already know what HIAS is, but just in case, we were originally formed as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society on the Lower East Side in New York 137 years ago, which actually makes us the oldest refugee-serving organization in the world. And while we started by serving exclusively Jewish refugees and asylum seekers, we now work with refugees and asylum seekers of all faiths from around the world. We have operations in 10 countries, and we resettle around this country as well. I'm serving as today's moderator, and I'm really honored to have these three really stellar panelists up here with me today. I'm going to do some quick introductions, and then we'll dive right in. So to my left is Hannah Evans. She is the lead lobbyist for immigration and refugee policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and she has also served as the co-chair of the steering committee for the Interfaith Immigration Coalition since 2015. To her left, we have Rabbi Jonathan Roos, who is the senior rabbi at Temple Sinai, which is one of the oldest and largest congregations here in Washington, D.C. And his synagogue has been deeply engaged in a variety of immigration issues, and so he'll be sharing his perspectives on that. And then last but certainly not least, we have Michael Hopkins, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Jewish Family Service of San Diego. JFS San Diego is really a true leader on a variety of immigration and refugee issues, including a remarkable response, and I mean that very literally, a remarkable response to an ever increasingly complicated situation at the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm also really proud to say that JFS San Diego is one of HIAS's resettlement partners, and we're really honored to be in partnership with them, and I'm pleased that he's here with us. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each panelist just for a few more minutes to speak a little bit more in more detail about their connection to this work. Then I'm going to ask them some questions that I hope will guide the broader conversation. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. We really want to make sure that at least 50% of the session is Q&A from all of you. So with that said, I'm going to toss it to Hannah so we can hear a little bit more about her, and then we'll move down the line.
Great. Thanks, Naomi, and thanks so much for having me. So as Naomi mentioned, I am the lead lobbyist at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And the Friends Committee on National Legislation is a Quaker lobby that was founded in 1943 to serve as a voice for Quakers and other like-minded folks in Washington to affect public policy to align with our values. And broadly speaking, that is peace and justice-oriented federal policies. And I also serve, I'm wearing my other hat of co-chair of the Interfaith Immigration Coalition, because in this work, the interfaith partnership and the faith-based understanding of the policies that we want to see is so important to our grounding and also to our efficacy on the federal level. So I want to just give a brief, just so you know, it's 53 national faith-based organizations that are part of the Interfaith Immigration Coalition. JCPA is one of them, as is HIAS, as is the RAC and NCJW and AJC, as well as Ben the Ark and TRUA. So there is a broad Jewish partnership within this coalition as well. And so together what we do is we leverage the interfaith voice to affect change. And what I often do is I am in the policy piece of it, in the weeds, but what we really need is to help translate this to what is happening on a community level. So that's why I'm really excited that all of you are here to try and think about how you can use the work that you may already be engaged in or want to be engaged in, and then build yourselves into constituent lobbyists and advocates and build a relationship with your member of Congress and their staff so that we can help push forward public policy change. And that's really what I'm here to help steer the conversation, to help you know how you can translate some of those pieces. And then really quickly, my own focus is on immigrant detention reform, demilitarized border policies, funding around refugee resettlement and protection, and then creating pathways to citizenship for people who do not currently have pathways in our current system. So that's a lot, and I'm going to stop there.
Oh, thank you. I sort of threatened them that I was going to be pretty vigilant about keeping time, and I think maybe that worked. So Rabbi, it's your turn.
Thanks, and thanks again, everyone, for being here today. Just to give you a little bit about my background and my congregation's connection and how we got into the work that we're doing, and a little bit more about what we're doing. So the synagogue was created in 1950, and it has always been a social justice-oriented congregation. It has been the outlook of Temple Sinai from the get-go. So being part of this work is not really far outside of the history of the congregation. We have a religious school of about 600 kids, and in that school we are constantly, every year and throughout the year, talking about the connection between Jewish values and immigration. And we didn't do that, and we haven't been doing that necessarily as a political issue, but as part of our lessons on the American Jewish historical experience. It's impossible not to talk about the immigrant experience. So we bring our students to Ellis Island and we have them do a deep dive into their family histories. When we study and we teach holidays like Passover, and we run the Seder, whether it's for our nursery school students or our oldest members in our community Seder, we are talking about the story of the Jewish people in the Exodus from Egypt and the wanderings. So throughout our history, from the beginning to the most recent years, the story of us as immigrants is part of what we teach, and it's part of what we talk about in the synagogue all the time. Now that being said, I also every year lead a group to Israel. And as part of that itinerary, we go to visit the Adlit Detention Camp Museum. Anyone ever been there? So it's between Tel Aviv and Haifa. It was a detention center run by the British in the pre-state years, and we go there every year. And in the summer of 2014, to give you a specific kind of turning point moment, that was the summer when the story of that huge wave of unaccompanied minors coming across the southern border was really dominating the news. In Israel that summer, end of June, early July, we were at the Adlit Detention Center, and the guide and the docent are talking about the waves of Jewish illegal immigration. That's the language that they use, that's the language we use when we talk about the Palyam, the Haganah branch that was bringing immigrants to Israel against the British blockade. And then we are standing in this camp where the immigrants were then being detained, where Jewish people seeking to make a better life in the land of Israel were being held behind barbed wire. And we celebrated the story of a Palmach raid that broke them out of the camp, and in which some British soldiers were killed, and it allowed these Jewish refugees to seek their lives in the homeland in Israel. And in that moment, it struck me that we have got to be bringing that element of the story into what we are talking about at home, and that we're reading in the papers about this wave of unaccompanied minors at the southern border in the US who are illegal immigrants, and we're here in Israel trying to deepen people's connection to Jewish life and Jewish values by telling them about our story as illegal immigrants. And it just struck me that we had to do more than simply talk about it or take them to Israel to learn about what it was like for our people. We had to begin to do something about it in our community. So from then to now, we got involved with everything from advocacy at a national level. As a DC-based congregation, we frequently go to the Hill and we join programs like the ones that Hannah described, and that HIAS and that the RAC and many of our partner groups are involved with. We also work one-on-one, providing direct service to asylum seekers and refugees who have been resettled in our area, whether it's providing them with tutoring support or support for food or medical care or some legal support. We get involved on those one-on-one cases, and just about everything in between. And as we talk more and answer some questions, I can give you a couple more specific examples. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It actually sounds like that old joke, a Quaker, a rabbi, and a social worker who were sitting at a bar talking about immigration. It's an honor to be here. As I was introduced, I'm the CEO of Jewish Family Service in San Diego. We're a 100-year-old organization. We're about this year will be close to a $25 million organization. Our immigration department has about 50 staff. But I want to back up 100 years, but don't worry, I'm not going to go year by year. But 100 years ago, actually, a group of Jewish women went down to the border in San Diego because there were Jews stuck at the border. It was 1918, it was right after World War I. And so back then, we did it because we were Jewish, and the folks that we were rescuing were Jewish. And today, we do this work because of our shared Jewish values. So it is pretty interesting. I'll just do really quickly. About 2 years ago at Jewish Family Service, we, along with the ACLU and a number of other faith-based organizations, ACLU is not faith-based, got together right when Trump was being elected, because we knew that in San Diego County there were about 200,000 individuals who were undocumented, and we knew that we needed to provide some kind of legal defense, know your rights, and we just wanted to be of service. With family as our middle name, we were really concerned that families, that dads or moms would be picked up and deported, and then the family would find itself in disarray. So our initial work was really to be there for members of our community that were concerned about deportation. The name of the project was Rapid Response, and then this October, as a result of the Rapid Response, we found ourselves getting calls with, literally, as you heard earlier, with folks, families being dropped off on the streets of San Diego. So since that time, we've been operating a shelter. On the table, I did pass out, I have more copies of some just general information around the shelter. I'm happy to talk about that and the work that we're doing just in immigration in general. It's funny, a week ago when I had the document printed, it said a little over 5,300, but today over 6,000 individuals have come through our migrant shelter. So we're talking about huge numbers, and I can tell you that this is not from the caravans, and it's complicated, and you know, earlier today we talked about some of the issues in terms of how families are treated and some of the conditions they experience, and we'll have a chance to talk about that, but more important, we'll have a chance to talk about how, as part of the organized Jewish community, each of you can get involved in these types of issues.
Thank you so much. So as I said, what I'm going to do is ask some targeted questions of each of our panelists, and I hope that will help guide the rest of the conversation. Hannah, I'm going to start with you because you are a policy person. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see in 2019, the major immigration policy issues are. I'm talking specifically from a federal level, but certainly if there are other state issues that you really want people to be watching out for, please feel free to throw those in. But really the priorities, what's coming up, what kind of advocacy are you gearing up for in 2019?
All right. Yeah, I think many of you probably tuned in this afternoon to what is happening at the border and various executive actions that have happened. Unfortunately, it is unpredictable exactly what will happen on the executive level of immigration policy, but we can expect that it will continue down the same path of very, very negative policy changes and proposals with impacts to migrants and immigrants and refugees and very vulnerable folks in our communities. The number one way that Congress can weigh in on this is through funding and through not allocating additional resources to help make these policy proposals become reality. And so the number one way that Congress can weigh in is around funding, particularly for the Department of Homeland Security in terms of the defensive of what we do not want to invest more money into, but also talking about how we want to invest money into refugee protection, into migrant protection, into legal orientation services. So that's going to be a big policy and advocacy priority going forward for what Congress can do. The other piece that I would say is oversight, and making sure that all of the pieces, all of the ways that you are experiencing these policy proposals, that you are encountering people who need help and legal services, making sure that those stories are getting to members of Congress, and where there are gaps of information, making sure that there is really, really robust oversight over what is and is not happening at the federal level. Because a lot of what we have been experiencing is that frankly, we have administrative officials who are not telling the truth under oath, and so we need to have continued pressure from constituents to elected officials to administrative officials to have robust oversight of what's actually happening. And then those two pieces are largely defensive, but what I would say is that all of this is building towards, we're at 2019, we have the elections are coming up in 2020, and we have an opportunity to help inject those conversations with the policy reforms that we do want. So forever talking about what is it, again, as I said, what do we want to invest in? What are the policy reforms that we need Congress to work on? And so just broadly, funding, oversight, and then building towards the policy reforms that we do want. That's going to be the big pieces for 2019 in an otherwise pretty unpredictable situation.
All right. Rabbi, this question is for you. I mean, as you mentioned, it seems like it's really sort of baked into the DNA of your synagogue social action, and that this is really something just organic almost, that for what your congregation does. But I'm wondering if you have any words of wisdom, if you will, about how to move Jewish institutions into this work who haven't done it yet necessarily. What steps do you need to take, or what push needs to happen in order to move an institution from a point of just beginning to really being engaged?
Sure, so let me say, first of all, a lot of what we do, we support advocacy work like the type that Hannah has described, and we try to use the institutional framework we have as in the spirit of being a house of learning, so that we can present sessions like this. So we happen to have a building and a room that looks like this, and people, and a way to advertise events. And so as events come up and things move quickly, we do try to use our institution as a place to get information out there. Whether we're going to ask you to act on that or not, whether you're going to be moved to act on that or not, we do have the opportunity to help present some information and to keep people educated, to cut through some of the clutter and all the noise, if you will. But there are some things I think that I would suggest, and things that you can do that we've done that might work for you. So first and foremost, I would say it's important to start with a discussion of the values. So it is baked into the DNA, we would argue, but it's not always so obvious. And there's a lot of DNA and a lot of material baked into that DNA. So I would say first and foremost, start, and you should start in your congregation, by lifting up these values, right? So making sure, in particular, that the congregation and the leadership of the congregation understands and is part of that shared narrative and understanding of those values. Whether the mitzvah is stated in the positive about welcoming or loving strangers, or in the negative that you shouldn't oppress the strangers, it shows up in so many places in our tradition, and that's something that we have to begin by just making sure those values are shared, taught, and understood by our leaders and our members. But then from there, I'll use one story for you kind of as an example. It's important to then get some people a little bit more deeply involved and to talk about it. So in 2014, when I came back from that Israel trip, and the wave of immigrant children were coming across the border, a group of us decided to just go to McAllen, Texas. McAllen happens to be the center of the Rio Grande sector for the Border Patrol, and I have a colleague from rabbinical school with a synagogue there, so we went, we stayed with him, and we volunteered at a respite center operated by Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley. So working there, we got to see with our own eyes what is really happening at the border. This was just a small handful of people who we had invited. So I didn't put a mass call out to the congregation. I didn't set off the alarm bells and say, hey, we're going to go down there en masse. I just took a handful of people, and we spent a few days, and we heard the stories from the immigrants, and we got to do the work one-on-one with some of the individuals, and to lift up those principles of loving and welcoming the stranger, regardless of what the participants thought about the politics of it, as an act of mercy, an act of chesed and tzedakah, to just go do that. We then came back, and I shared the story in our bulletin with the temple membership. Now from that, one temple member, who's a lawyer in DC, who happened to be working a pro bono case to represent two children, Katerina and Astrid, they're Honduran girls who had come in that wave of unaccompanied minors, she was providing the support legally. And one of the girls was sick and hadn't been able to get to a doctor, and navigating some of those social service agencies was just too much for this particular lawyer to handle, because she also has her own caseload. So having read the article and talked about it publicly, she thought, let me call the rabbi. She called me and said, here's the story. Now, we're a synagogue. Somewhere in this synagogue there's a doctor. So I know we can tap that network, and I called one or two of the doctors and said, here's the story, would you be willing to help? Just between, the private connection here. So sure, this doctor helped, and she saw the two girls, and then from that, she connected them to some other people, and then we continued to help with things like their schooling needs, and some of their home needs and clothing when the weather turned cold, and it was a little bit of a larger program as it expanded. And from that, we had more and more people involved, and then we shared that story publicly with the congregation. We've been doing this, and this is the great success we're having, and from there we've grown slowly to more and more events, including partnering with groups like Lutheran Social Services here in the area to help adopt a refugee family, to work with like CARE Coalition, another local immigrant rights coalition, to help an asylum seeker here in town. But starting from that small step and helping just as an act of mercy, of chesed, and of just one-on-one, particularly with these girls, and sharing it with the community really made the difference in getting us started.
Okay, we're going to come back to, I mean, you were just talking about some proactive ways that you got involved. We're going to come back in a few minutes to talk about some challenges perhaps with the work. But Michael, now the question is for you. You have made it very clear that the work you do would be impossible were it not for the coalitions with which you work. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about coalition work, both some of what makes that successful and important, and maybe even some of the challenges and how you've navigated those.
Right, thank you. So actually, even in Jonathan's remark, he mentioned Lutheran services and he mentioned Catholic charities. And so he was beginning to answer the question that you just asked, that how do you do this work? So I mentioned that from the very beginning, we created what was called a rapid response network, that in most of our communities, if you're dealing with immigration or you're dealing with refugees, it is not like a Jewish faith issue. It is a community issue. And that from the very beginning, if your CRC is planning to get involved in in immigration issues, there has to be representatives of the other faiths sitting around the table. I can't think of a better way to take an issue that has become incredibly political and to make it a humanitarian issue. And the moment that you put faith leaders around the table, it becomes a humanitarian issue and not a political issue. And I think to be effective for us, this is not about the left or the right or about the Democrats or the Republicans or whether we should build a wall or not build a wall. It is about a humanitarian issue. And I think that the only way that I know to do that is to be sitting around with other faith leaders. In addition, I mentioned in the beginning that we partnered with the ACLU. And I would tell you that in all of our communities, there is an ACLU. I would encourage you to knock on their door. I would encourage you to have them sitting around the table. And some very specific examples is that there are times where we have held press conferences where Jewish Family Service and the Jewish community, we don't even appear because we don't want to be part of what the ACLU is doing. And then there are other times where we take the leadership role because we work with government in a way that the ACLU doesn't. ACLU, their job is to hold government accountable. That's not our job. Our job is to partner with government. And so there are just many times that we have been really strategic around which partner takes the lead, around which organization takes the lead, knowing, being sensitive to the optics. I'll just give you one quick example. Literally on Friday, we had a delegation from the White House visit our shelter. It was not anything that we wanted to be part of. It was our, oh my gosh, the White House is coming to visit our shelter. We actually knew what their intention was. Their intention was to create the evidence to create a national emergency, a national border emergency. And they were literally coming to San Diego to identify the health aspects of folks coming across the border. And since we do a medical screening for everyone who comes across the border, we know exactly the health status of every single migrant. And so they wanted to visit us to be able to document chickenpox, mumps, measles, all sorts of illnesses that are coming across the border. Now, we didn't want to be part of it, but we were told by the county, which is one of our partners, that we had to be part of it. I can tell you who was not part of it was ACLU, right? So ACLU, as you know, is working right now on planning to sue the Trump administration around the Remain in Mexico policy. That was a bit of our conversation, and so they chose to not be there. But I just have to tell you that we are very intentional, and the partnership actually allows us at different times for me to actually say, oh, I don't feel that way, or Jewish Family Service or the Jewish community doesn't feel this way. That's the feeling of this organization. So there are times that we use the partnership when it serves us well, and there are times that we use the partnership when it doesn't serve us well to be able to say that we feel differently. So there's just so many advantages, but frankly, in all of this work, just the ability, because we're running a shelter, we obviously use hundreds and hundreds of volunteers, and just to be able to leverage volunteers to organize clothing drives, to be able to organize to get folks to the airport, their network just expands our reach. So that would be my vote.
No, thank you. I mean, the work that you are doing with that shelter is beyond inspirational. So thank you for that. So this question is for both you, Rabbi, and Michael, because it would be remiss, I think, for us to have a panel like this and not talk about some of the obstacles, right? This is hard. This is hard work for a lot of different reasons. And I'm wondering if both of you could think a little bit about and speak to what some of the obstacles are in terms of getting the American Jewish community deeply engaged with these issues, whether it's advocacy or direct services. Are there sort of obstacles in our community that you've become aware of, and if so, how have you navigated those?
I'll start. The obstacles for us appeared 2 years ago when the first travel bans were enacted. And we started taking a very kind of forward approach to, because at that time at Jewish Family Service, most of the refugees that we were bringing over were from Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, and so this was going to directly affect them. At that time, I'm sure most of you are aware of the same issue. There were some very loyal Republican supporters of the Federation and even of Jewish Family Service, calling, emailing. I can't believe you're bringing over terrorists. These are awful people in our community. Forget about my donation. Our board for a while didn't really know what to do, and then our board decided that that if we were going to operate a program, if we were going to do immigration work, if we were going to do refugee work, that we couldn't do it in the dark of night. We couldn't do it quietly. We couldn't do it if we're not comfortable. If we're going to run a program, then we're going to give voice to that program. And there was no sort of operate a program and be shy about it. And so that was really kind of a coming of age for us, where even if we didn't think we needed to be involved in policy, we had no choice, because we found ourselves literally, with literally dozens and dozens of members of our church community at the airport, and looking to us for information, for understanding what was happening, for why it was happening. Fast forward, I would tell you that if we lost half a dozen or a dozen donors, they have been replaced by hundreds of donors that were given to the ACLU that weren't giving to us. We've been replaced by hundreds and hundreds of donors that are loyal supporters of Planned Parenthood. I would tell you that the folks on the left of these issues are way more passionate, way more philanthropic than the handful for us in San Diego, the handful of Republican donors who said, this is awful, this is ugly, I can't believe you are doing it. But that was one of the obstacles, the fear that it would impact the bottom line. I think that maybe for a day we thought we could stay in the middle and not take a side on the left or the right, no pun intended. But we really realized that there was no choice but to sort of be aligned with the programs we do and our values and our mission.
Yeah. So look, this is an old joke. You probably know something like this. In the congregation, there's a fight over standing at a certain point in the service, and nobody can decide whether you should stand at this point or sit at this point. And they decide that they're going to go into the history and figure out when did we start standing at this point in the service when no one else does that. So they ask all the members, no one can remember. They go to the oldest member, who's 100 years old, and they ask, do you remember standing and sitting? No, I don't remember that. Do you remember when we started doing that? No, I don't remember that. Well, we need your help. Nobody else knows. Everyone is at each other's throats, and they're fighting terribly. Fighting terribly? I remember that. The truth is, there's always the threat and the reality of that internal division and the rancor and argument, sometimes over things, certainly in congregations, if not in any organization. One of the biggest challenges is the fear of that rancor. So for us, it's a question about membership. It's like the donors that you experienced. So synagogues, my experiences, are very sensitive to member satisfaction and dissatisfaction. We live in a world where synagogue membership in many places is declining. No synagogue wants to do anything that's going to alienate a single member. So the truth be told, that joke contains the kernel of truth. I don't mean to say we should encourage fighting within our synagogue, but there's always disagreement about so many things. So sometimes the fear of the disagreement is worse than the disagreement itself. That's one piece. I think another piece is there is a fear, sometimes a protest, against what people would describe as bringing politics into the pulpit, right? So people will say after certain sermons, I don't want to hear politics from the pulpit, which always makes me ask in response, well, what did you want to hear about? Because this isn't that I'm talking about politics in a partisan sense. We're talking about real life and the application of Jewish values to real life. And usually what people are complaining about is that I don't like the position that you're taking because my personal politics don't agree with yours. And I get that, by the way, from both directions, right? Sometimes it's from people who are more conservative than me, and sometimes it's from people who are more progressive than me. But the idea that you can't, quote, talk politics from the pulpit or within the congregation is really a way of saying we shouldn't be talking about any of the stuff of real life and trying to apply Jewish values to it. Now, we can go too far, I do think, sometimes in that, but to say we can't talk about it at all, or the idea that we're going to keep anything political out of the congregation, really isn't possible, and that's one of the great challenges that we face.
Okay, thank you. So we originally planned, I'm going to make a quick game time decision here, to have you all speak at your own tables and come up with some questions, but I actually think we have a manageable size in the room. So instead of doing that, we're just going to open it up for a general Q&A. We have just shy of half an hour to do that. You can ask us anything that's related to what we were discussing, but so policy questions, I might jump in on some of that with Hannah as well. Anything about the work that's being done here in DC, San Diego, we would love to hear from you and be a resource, hopefully. Oh, and I would also just ask if you could identify yourself in the organization that you're representing. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Walter Spiegel. I'm president of JCRC of Cincinnati. And my question is probably more for Naomi and Hannah here. We had a concerted effort last year to engage in an advocacy campaign, particularly around the DREAM Act. We got pretty much nowhere because our entire congressional delegation in southwestern Ohio has bought into the Trump administration. And so I'm trying to understand if we as an organization are interested in further advocacy, what are the fruitful approaches for us to take, because we're up against, we're hitting up against a stone wall.
Do you want to start and then I'll
Yeah.
jump in? Okay.
You did make a difference. You made a huge difference. The DREAM Act used to not be talked about at all. People didn't used to know who DACA recipients were. It wasn't something that was on the table. And it certainly wasn't something that was front of mind for Republican legislators. And I can say that it's on the table, and we can see that you've made progress in that because it keeps coming back as a sweetener to be paired with otherwise detrimental proposals. And so I think that, I would just say that in a year alone, the fact that there are more people who are aware of the status of Dreamers is a huge win. So just know that you did it. I think that what I would say is that our general philosophy also is you're not always going to agree with your legislator on everything, but it is important for you to build up a working relationship with their staff and with the legislator to the extent that you can, so that you get to that breaking point, so that when there is a moment of agreement, you can actually, you have built up a relationship and trust and rapport so that they know that you're a trusted community that is there not for political reasons, not to, slam you later during an election cycle, but to actually make changes as aligned with values. And so the number one way is to just keep going back. And I know that can feel frustrating, totally, and it feels as if you're not making progress, but I just want to assure you that you have made progress. And in a similar vein, I would say that we are around funding and around just alongside the DREAM. I know I'm going up, but alongside the DREAM Act, right? We are at a moment where people are openly and vocally questioning how we are doing immigration enforcement, and questioning the role of detention, questioning the role of automatic deportation, and that's happening in a way that has never happened before. And I would say that, again, that is partially because of the DREAM Act advocacy, and because people have been listening very clearly to affected communities saying, we don't want our protection to be paired with pieces that are going to undermine other people in our communities. So relationship building and being very persistent and prophetic in your asks.
I agree with everything Hannah said, and speaking from the perspective of somebody of an organization that works a lot on refugee resettlement and asylum issues, we have found the same thing. Sometimes I feel like with what's going on with the current administration, we in the advocacy team, we wake up, we go full steam ahead and run into a wall every single day. We bounce back, we wake up the next morning, we run into the same wall, and that, it wouldn't be honest, it would be disingenuous for me to say that's not frustrating or that's not exhausting. It is, we're in the same boat as you, but victory really does look different these days. aren't necessarily seeing tremendous in the refugee space or asylum space, tremendous legislative victories the way we would want to see, or moving the administration the way we would want. But it is making a difference. That drip, drip, drip of consistency of letting these offices know, not only am I here as a staff member of HIAS, but HIAS represents, we have now more than 400 welcoming congregations around the country. We resettle in 10, 12 communities. We're representing here a vast swath of the American Jewish community, and you need to take us seriously. And to be very frank with you, elected officials care about getting elected again, and they need to keep hearing, I can't ignore this group of people in my district or in my state. This is very important to them. So if nothing else, it helps to maybe temper some of the rhetoric that would be more extreme. And the victories look different. As Hannah says, it is about having those relationships, and this is not meant to be a partisan discussion, but in the Republican offices that might be coming at these issues from a different perspective, so that they know that they can trust us, that we are coming to them in good faith, and that we are a resource. And I think it does make a difference, and it's getting us to a place where when the administration changes, we will have a much more educated group of elected officials on the Hill. And the fact of the matter also is that I think some of these Republican offices that have not been willing or able to come out publicly on behalf of refugee and asylum issues, in fact, don't disagree with us as much as we might think. And so when the political calculus changes on a national level in a different way, I think we're going to start seeing a return to this bipartisan nature of the program the way it used to be, since 1980. So all this just to say, keep running into that same wall. We're running with you, but it's important to keep at it, because if we stop, who's going to keep talking about it, right? And that's part of the work.
And can I just throw one thing in there? I would suggest the advocacy is crucially important, right? Changing at the top is the most important, but adding in some of this direct service, even if it's a one-on-one, one-day experience, because you're volunteers and you need a little bit of that energy and the spirits to be lifted occasionally. Running into the wall every day gets really frustrating. You need to experience a victory, and if it's having fed a child or helped someone to be able to see a doctor or navigate the school system or learn English who otherwise wasn't able to do it, that's a victory that you and your people will feel that can then give you the energy to keep doing exactly what these guys are talking about. I think that's an important piece to add.
How about you, Matt? Go ahead.
I'm a new delegate that's coming from Princeton. We're just starting a JCRC there. But I want to combine what I'm learning, because the whole panel's been excellent. But Rabbi and something that Hannah said, I backed into it in my professional life, and now I can see, because you put it together for me, where we can bring it to the Jewish community and make it work. And what it is one, to start the discussion about underlying values first, which Rabbi had said, before you just rush out to do it. And the other was the suggestion that it be interfaith. And I have found that the group Muslims for Peace, because I was working with very, very at-risk, homeless, destitute children and families, had a great need to, because of the Quran, if you understand the Quran, do good and help take care of these strangers in need who are children and just need community's protection. It's a good common ground, and what I'd like to suggest to my JCRC is not just that we share discussions about common values, because this is the place where it comes together, but they want the community to see that as Muslims, they do care. And they've made it, they were all immigrants, they've made it, they've done well in America, but as a people, they care about others who haven't, and especially children and at-risk families. And the whole thing is relationship building, not just a discussion. I think it will attract younger Jewish people to join the JCRC and be a part of it. But the second part is they actually go out and have holiday parties for the most at-risk children. They don't just discuss it, they buy very good food and then send it home with the families, and gifts of clothing and whatever, so that it becomes an activity and not just an intellectual thing, but it brings the interfaith community together in this case, and it can be done around immigrants. We certainly have plenty of that where we are in New Jersey, but it gets to their own immigrant experience and their Muslim background. it really is both. Every one of them, 100% were immigrants, and every one of them have made an American dream. And they want Muslims to have a better image because it crosses over ethnic, country, origin. So it was very helpful to listen to the suggestions and stuff.
That's good to hear, good feedback already. Sir, go ahead.
Bill Franklin for the Jewish Federation of Reading, Pennsylvania. Mark Tedfield in a previous session mentioned that immigrants not getting protection is covered under international law. Do you know the specific law he's referring to, and why is it not more known or being used as an argument here in our country?
Well, I'm assuming that this was in the context of what's going on at the border with asylum seekers, and the international law to which he would have been referring is the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the U.S. actually didn't sign on in 1951. We signed on to the protocol in 1967. But what that basically, that document, that convention did is define who refugees are, who asylum seekers are. It laid out the 5 grounds by which somebody could be defined as a refugee and really helped to map out the international response to refugee crises. And it came directly out of the experience from World War II when there was such, obviously, a mass forced displacement crisis. So the global community came together after that and put this together. And it really is laid the international framework, and then that is the foundation that the U.S. used when we put together our refugee law, the most recent one in 1980, the 1980 Refugee Act. It uses the same definitions that are in that 1951 convention, and so it helps to define the parameters around which we are supposed to be adhering to basic tenets of international and domestic law.
And you said it was the 1951 Immigration Convention?
1951 Refugee Convention.
But I do think that what Mark was referring to was that where in a criminal court proceeding, you would have the right to an attorney. There's nothing like that around immigration.
Oh, I see.
So in an asylum hearing, the majority go in and try to file for asylum on their own, while the data is that you're 5 times more successful if you have an attorney. But it's very hard to find pro bono attorneys around the country who actually can practice immigration law.
Oh, I'm sorry if I misunderstood.
No, I think it's all the same.
Okay.
It's just it's an add to your answer.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Jessica Cohen, I'm the CRC director in Cleveland, Ohio. Naomi, just following up on what you had kind of just talked about, the question before, when the administration changes or the party changes in the federal level, what of all the things that are happening now, what can quickly and easily go back to the way it was before, and what do you see as being kind of irrevocably changed because of this period?
That's a good question. I'm happy to do this, and I'm going to ask Hannah to answer a little bit as well. I'll still focus on the refugee and asylum piece, and then maybe Hannah, you can do more broadly some of the broader immigration rights work. I think from the refugee resettlement perspective, HIAS is one of the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, which means we have a contract with the State Department, and we resettle around the country with local partners, including in San Diego. What this administration has done is lowered the number of refugees who could possibly come in any given year. The refugee admission ceiling has been lowered dramatically. This year, the target is 30,000. At the rate we're going, we'll be lucky if we get to 20,000. Last fiscal year, the target was 45,000. We admitted 22,000. And so that will be very easy for the next president, who perhaps will be hopefully more supportive of the resettlement program, to set that goal higher at a more historical average. On average, the presidential determination, that ceiling was at 90,000. So it would be not hard to get to that level, but it will be hard to crank up the system again, because as these numbers have been shrinking, the resettlement infrastructure at the national and the local level has been changed rather radically. And so that is going to take time to come up again. But I think making that political statement saying that refugee resettlement is a priority for this country again, we can get back to that place. It's going to take some time though. And I think with the asylum piece, we have been very lucky in spite of the onslaught of negative policies that this administration has been throwing at us. Most of them have been caught up in the courts. The judicial system has been our savior here. And I think it should not be too incredibly difficult. I mean, if things continue to be held up in the courts, to get the asylum system, and there were flaws with the asylum system. I don't mean to suggest that this was perfect before the administration, but I think if the courts keep doing what they've been doing, I think that we should be able to level set again with that as well. Damage has been done. I mean, families have been torn apart. You know, there are real human impacts here. But I think with those systems, it will take time. But I think those are two places where we have real optimism that the movement is so strong now that hopefully it will not be impossible to build those systems back up.
Yeah, I think the main piece is just anything that is an infrastructure change is going to not be immediately reversible. And so that is both the eroding of infrastructure around the refugee resettlement program and that processing, but also any permanent change. So barrier construction on the southern border will be irreversible to an extent in terms of the damage that it creates. The detention centers, as we build more detention centers up, that's an actual infrastructure that is not just money one year, it is permanent changes and actual bed space that needs to then be undone. And then the other piece that is not reversible overnight is the damage, the psychological damage that we have done, the actual people who are deported, the families that are being separated under these new policies where everyone is a priority for deportation. And so I want to make sure that we're really clear that as we're talking, the urgency is really right now. But that's similarly, I think the danger is that if there is an administration shift, and when there is one, and as new members of Congress come in, I want to make sure that we're building a movement that's not just against this particular administration, but is for what the policies that we want. Because otherwise, if Trump is gone, then it just becomes, okay, well, we can go back to the status quo. And the status quo was not good. The status quo still meant that we were putting way too much emphasis on enforcement and not on reform. And so that's what I started with saying, building towards the future, staking out the policy priorities. That needs to always be part of the defensive conversation as well. It's not just about being against what's happening now, it's about building towards better.
I see you want to get
I would just add on the positive side, the most important work is the lack of a comprehensive immigration program for our country. Right? So there is somewhere between 10.7 and 11 million undocumented folks in our country. And some resolution, right? It's not practical to deport 11 million people. And so the resolution of what's going to happen to all of those individuals, the 700, 800,000 dreamers that are across the country, that's the important policy work that must be addressed once we're past Trump.
And I would just add, one of the silver linings, and I mean, obviously we wish we weren't in this position now, but the silver lining, I think, is the momentum in the American Jewish community around these issues is getting stronger by the day. This deep, deep bench of engaged Jews who are concerned with these issues, and obviously not just in our community, but across the country, that is really going to put us in a good position when there is change that we will be able to push for proactive things. I am counting on the fact that this coalition that we've put together isn't going to dissipate when things look a little rosier. And I think it is going to really put us in a good position to continue to be a strong force, a strong moral voice, and really be able to make some real change, I think. Yes, sir.
Is there more, you've been focused a good bit on the federal level in your work, your strong work on the federal side. Is there more that states, local jurisdictions can do that you're working towards, working with, and trying to affect change at the local level?
Yeah, Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about just the California
Yeah, so
context?
I know that California is as blue as it gets, and it may not be like other states around the country, but I do think that there are a variety of things that states can do. California is one example where where undocumented folks can get driver's license, they can go to college, they can go to community college, they can, so there are specific things that states can do. Our state has also been incredibly in terms of funding priorities. They're funding dreamers to go back to university. There is a lot. Our shelter will eventually get millions of dollars of operating dollars from the state. So as much as we do think that this is a federal issue, that various states around the country have acted, and maybe you could talk more about other states other than California.
Yeah, sure thing. Hannah, do you want to jump in, and then I can?
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, a big part is states deciding how they are going to be interacting with federal policy changes. And so the number 2 ways that I will say is through sanctuary and trust policies of how they are saying that local and state law enforcement is interacting with federal immigration enforcement. And then also around detention facilities. So they're hyper-local, whether you are going to enter into a contract with a detention facility, and there's been a really awesome momentum around communities saying we don't want to have jobs or money from our locality tied up in immigrant detention because it's not sustainable and not aligned with our values. So those are two awesome ways that states can.
And from the refugee asylum perspective, there are a lot of ways that might seem like they're just symbolic, but actually really have a major impact. So even at a municipal level, making yourself a welcoming community, a receiving community, putting yourself on the record as saying, we are welcoming to refugees and to immigrants and to asylum seekers. That is important because elected officials really pay attention to things like that. The same thing at the state level, right? Taking every step possible to make sure that your state legislature is on the record, on the right side of these issues. Federal issues to be sure, but that is really important because again, elected officials are paying attention to what's going on in those communities. And so every opportunity that you can to speak out on refugee and asylum issues at the local level has an impact here at the federal level. But as Hannah and Michael were saying, I couldn't begin to get into all of the different state issues that are going on in terms of driver's license or detention beds or all of that, but it is all really connected to the federal to the federal piece. I would also say that it is really important at the local level, especially in communities that have lost resettlement infrastructure, for people to raise a holy heck about that and to really make sure that elected officials know that that you want to continue to welcome refugees and to get local elected officials involved in that fight. We frequently are putting together letters with mayors or governors. That stuff matters here in DC.
And let me just throw one thing in there also. I'm not the policy expert, these guys are, but this is both to Jessica Cohen's comment and question and to yours, Thorne. Keep your eyes on the private prisons, because that is also something that has been transformative. Immigrant detention, for anyone who watched the movie last night, and if, in the sense of the intersection between this issue and other issues, immigrant detention has been a boon for the private prison industry in a way that is transformative and not very easy to be undone. So even if things like immigration detention changes, those beds are going to be used, and those corporations have a vested interest in shareholder wealth that needs to be preserved that will dictate increased detention for them. And that's something that can be decided on the state level. So for example, the state of Maryland does not allow private prisons. The state of Israel, by the way, does not allow private prisons also. Virginia allows private prisons. Georgia allows private prisons. So increasingly, you can work on the state level to prevent and to try and keep your state from allowing private prisons to be the means for detention.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
So, Michael, I'm curious if there are ways that local Jewish community organizations, congregations, JCCs, whatever, can plug into the work that you're doing, and assuming that is replicable at other social service agencies that are doing similar work to yours. Like, what can we take back to our communal institutions and say, here's how you plug into this important work?
So I feel like it's going to sound like a Yom Kippur appeal. So I'm sorry, Rabbi.
I'm going to take notes on how you do this. So.
You can bend over the tab on your cards. So on the back of the handout, there is a GoFundMe page, and so obviously this work is very expensive. So if you want to do something very specific, you can help fund probably the only migrant shelter operated by the Jewish community in the United States. So that would be one way. A second way is there is an Amazon wish list. All of them, so you should know that right now, out of the 6,000 folks that have processed through our migrant center, probably 98% of them have gone to your communities. They've gone east of the Mississippi. When they leave, we give them winter coats, we give them hats, gloves, boots. Things like underwear has to be brand new, and so there is an Amazon wish list, so we desperately need clothes. The men, for example, their average waist size is 28-inch waist. I don't think there's anyone in this room that qualifies. And so, and then I have to tell you that in San Diego, to try to get winter coats donated, it's a bit of a challenge. And so we definitely need clothing. The other thing that's been really helpful, and some of the other JFSs around the country have sent staff. The East Bay in Berkeley, Avi Rose, the executive director, and one of his clinical social workers came down. We use volunteers. Catholic Charities has been amazing around the country. We can use volunteers. So one of the problems with San Diegans that volunteer is they do an hour a week or 2 hours a week. or even 4 hours a week, and that's great, but then by the time we train you, like you're gone. Where it's only for 4 hours. And so what we love about volunteers that come from across the country is they come for a week and they end up working 8-hour shifts, so they work a 10-hour shift. They're there the entire week, which means that they then can learn all of the protocols to operate the shelter. And so we would be happy to work with you in terms of, like, if you had congregations that want to come down or volunteers to come down, we'd be happy to find meaningful volunteer work.
One last question, going once. Yeah, I saw your hand.
Bob Bornstein, I'm the JCRC director in Portland. You obviously talked about advocacy and direct service, but it seems like there's another piece, which is that you see negative ideas, negative stereotypes seeping into the American mainstream. I'm just wondering, we've been hearing criminals and invaders and infestation. What specific strategies are you using to counter that dehumanization in the general public?
Want to start, Rabbi?
So look, first internally, I know this is not the general public so much, but so for me, it's talking about it in sermons and making it a topic and an issue that we will discuss within the congregation, and encouraging people, tell your friends about this, right? This is something not just to stay in the sanctuary, but take this message out with you into the community, writing and making sure that you put op-ed pieces in local newspapers, and having those conversations and inviting neighbors and friends from outside of your community, from your congregation or your organization, to be part of that and continue to make sure that we are standing against that kind of language. Again, it is striking to me, as someone who ends up at the Holocaust Museum with students a couple of times a year, it is always striking to me to see the parallel between the language, and to remind our own people and to remind the world of that is very important.
I would just add, I would say that most of our Jewish community is not very savvy around social media. And this is a huge opportunity through, whether it's, like my children are on Instagram, they're not on Facebook, and my son tweets, and so I tweet. And the question is, like, how much are we paying attention to social media? Because that is, in fact, where a huge segment of our community and are getting their news and their information. And so stories around immigrants and their success, and stories around immigrants in terms of how they are impacting our community, those are important stories, and they're easily shared through social media.
Yeah, I struggle with this a lot. I think it's very difficult, and there's kind of a piece of, you don't want to even give validation to the narrative by repeating it or responding to it, but also I think the main way for faith communities to engage is that faith communities are already engaging with the people who are being dehumanized and being labeled as something that people are not. And so what I often do is I remind people that we're talking about people, right? We are talking about people, and then also sharing the stories of how this encounter is already happening, and that alone breaks that myth. It is a myth busting in and of itself by saying, okay, well, if people were actually that dangerous, if it was criminals, if it was all the things, then how it doesn't make any sense. And so I think just like continuing to share stories, I would echo the plug for letters to the editor and media appearances and trying to inject that into the narrative.
I guess one more. I would push out facts. Facts do matter. San Diego, the safest big city in the country.
Yeah.
Right? So you would think that bad hombres come over and that it's a dangerous place and the migrants are just lined up across the border and they're just robbing people. Safest big city in North America.
Yeah, and in addition to all of that, HIAS, it's exactly what you said. So much of what's permeating the mainstream media is really dehumanizing about in the discussions about immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. And so HIAS is really trying very hard and is making a very strategic, conscientious effort to making sure that we are doing the exact opposite, that we are telling stories about individuals, and most importantly, that refugees are telling their own stories. It is so much more effective to hear from somebody who's been through this process, hear directly from them than hear me talk about it, right? So making sure that we are breaking these big, scary policy issues down into human stories, we are working very, very hard at that, and I think in the long run it helps to make a difference. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this up and just say thank you again for coming, and I know that at least I'm going to go ahead and speak for the other panelists. Like, we really do want this to be the start of an ongoing conversation. And so if you have questions for any one of us, please feel free to get in touch. If you don't know how, please be in touch with the JCPA staff, and they will certainly, Tammy will be able to direct you to us, because we do want to be an ongoing resource for all of you in your work. And thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
New Year is to try and do more communication through the legal and say, like, you know, this thing that you're hearing about, here's what's really going on.
I'm not sick, I'm just heading down.
It's very dry here. If you want, there's, I believe, water at the back.
Okay, do you know where the forum room is?
The what?
The forum room?
Which session are you going to? It's going to be around the corner. I'm actually headed there as well. So.
I'll try to finish it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's good to see you. Oh, that's right. Oh, okay, so you. Oh my gosh, so you know me. Oh, good. So you. I'm glad I'm happy. You had some real possibilities. Thank you for coming out. It's nice to meet you in person. Yeah, it's really nice. As a matter of fact, I was just having a lunch with Were you part of some of the trainings at HIAS? That's what. Yeah, that's right. Okay. How are you? Yeah, and Janice and Tanya, I was just having lunch with her. Sort of a continuation.
Yeah, it is.
Alright, now I have to
Yeah,
remember what my.
oh, good. Okay, good. Yeah, so I just saw Janet a few minutes ago. Yeah, no, thanks for coming up.
It's, you know, you shouldn't feel that bad because there are people who I've been trying to get it started for years, and it's like,
No, that's it.
Oh, yeah, right.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
It does make us, well, I mean, and like, yeah, I figured that was, I mean, it's true. But I would be happy to talk more. I'd be happy to talk yeah, because it sounds like they have,
I feel your pain. I don't have the same experience, but I feel your pain.
It's hard.
Yeah, no, it's a really good gift. I got to
Although Cincinnati trains, Cincinnati, live in Cincinnati, kids are born there. Oh, yeah, sure.
so much of what was told are the federal government. So being able to actually say, so much of the support, like the faith community. Hey, am I gonna be able to find you later for this validation?
Yeah. I will be out in the hall.
This place is way too fancy for me. I like drove my car up and it has like I parked under a tree. My sister lives in Glendale. Really? Who's that? Right, so I drove up and was like, oh, and that's a time. I'm that person.